Hello, everyone. Good to see you here, and welcome to this session on contracting digital projects, practical steps for libraries working with suppliers and partners. LibraryOn's delighted to have teamed up with the Space to support the delivery of this session today. My name's Jill Brown. I'm the Programme Manager for LibraryOn. I'm a white woman wearing a blue jumper and white top with green polka dots. And I've got curly brown hair, blue eyes, and I'm sitting in my spare room. So a little bit about LibraryOn. We exist to increase digital access to libraries, and we work to raise the profile of libraries online. And our website features a map of all UK libraries and information about them, as well as an events feature and content to showcase libraries. We also undertake extensive marketing activity, and we've awarded over 1.8 million in public funding to English library services for digital projects. The Space, who we're working with, supports the arts, culture, and heritage sectors to create digital content and experiences that entertain, inspire, and educate their audiences and visitors. It increases digital skills and creativity amongst those producing digital cultural content and also increases public engagement with it. So you might have been to one of our expert sessions previously. These are on digital topics chosen by libraries, and all are available to watch again via the LibraryOn website. And we've covered things like AI, data, special collections, and much more. And we also ran a session with the Space on avoiding digital harm last year. The Space also has an amazing range of resources available on their website and also on their library's playlist on YouTube, so you can explore those if you haven't already.
And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm John White. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the Space. I'm a white, middle-aged man with short brown hair, a beard, and round glasses, and an olive green top. And I'm sitting in my home office. And I'm now, if you give me 1 second, just going to share my screen so we can see my slides, hopefully. Linda, can you just give me a thumbs up? That's all in order. Great. So prior to working at the Space, when I've been here 10, 11 years, my previous job was running a web agency, making online games for people like Lego and CBBC, and also building digital systems. So I've sat in the last 20 years, both on the supplier side of digital contracts and on the client stroke funder side. And in that time, I think I've contracted more than 500 digital projects of different shapes and sizes. What I'm going to attempt to do in the next 20 minutes is condense everything I've learned from that into some key points for you. So there's quite a lot to cover. As has been mentioned, we will share slides afterwards, so you don't need to scribble furiously. So here goes. I think there's a tendency for most of us perhaps to think of contracts as those lengthy, slightly impenetrable documents, terminology we might not completely understand, that we have to reluctantly wade through. What I want to suggest is, at their best, contracts can be really good at building a shared understanding in as clear as possible language of what a project is about. And they can be really important in preventing misunderstandings that might arise about who owns what, how long something's going to take, what it might cost, and what to do if, as is often the case with digital projects, something changes as you're going. So they're crucially important as the foundation for building good relationships with partners. Spending some time up front, working things through and getting clarity is really useful at avoiding disputes in future. But before you even begin work on a contract, there are some constraints to really think through. I've given myself a tongue twister title to this slide, which I won't read out. One of those, if it's publicly funded, if you've got some grant money to run a project, might be what the requirements of the funder are that you need to put into your contract with the supplier. So that could be around meeting certain accessibility standards, making sure the funder is clearly credited in the materials being created. Or it might be, which is the case, for example, with the Heritage Lottery Fund, that they have very specific requirements around how the digital outputs of a project need to be shared, need to continue to be made available to the public, etc. So worth checking first if there's anything that funders are requiring you to do. In the council environment, which I suspect quite a lot of you are working in, talking to counsel legal about whether there's anything you need to follow from their point of view. Again, that might be around a tendering process, for example, or standard terms and conditions, or even a standard contract that your suppliers will need to sign up to. So getting clarity on that. Equally with IT, if what you're creating needs to be compatible with other systems, or it needs to be hosted by the council, or it's simply that there are standards around data security that you need to be following. Again, understanding what those are so you can make sure those are included in any contracting. More broadly, a good project is going to require time and input from yourself as well as from the supplier, and that can be quite significant effort. So thinking about whether you have your own resources, time and expertise, or whether you need to bring in other resources to make sure you can run this project well. I have come across situations where people are halfway through planning moving to a different system or building something new before they realize they can't actually easily exit existing arrangements. So if you're looking at replacing something old with a new system, can you exit the existing contract? Can you get data from one system to another in an easy and manageable way? And finally, on budget, and I'll talk on budget a little bit more later on, but it's not just thinking about do you have the funds to build the thing, but also if it's got any kind of lifespan, can you afford to host, maintain, and in all likelihood develop and modify it in future? So making sure you've got the resources to run the project at a scale that you need. There are two broad types of digital projects you might be doing in terms of how that reflects in the contract. And those can be described as thinking about it in terms of a blueprint, where you've got a very clear idea of what the outputs might be. So, for example, you're building a website, you have a sense of how many sections you need, what the functionality is in those sections, what you want members of the public to be able to do, what you want your library staff who are managing the content on the website to be able to do. So that can all be scoped out in a blueprint type approach. Alternatively, you might have a creative project, you're working with artists or a creative agency. You don't exactly know what the finished work is going to be, but what you can describe in a contract is the process of getting there. So you can think about how many days the creative team might put into different stages of work. You can describe that. You might describe review points where they bring you a prototype to review, so you have a sense of progress. So blueprint versus journey. And there will be contracts that are a bit of a mix of the two, where you know some of the outputs, but there are some areas that you describe the process of exploring and identifying them. Most importantly, then, is to know what success would look like so you can sign it off at the end. And that could be in terms of the functionality, the sort of thing I've just described, but it might be about adherence to accessibility standards, or there may be other success criteria about how many members of the public engage with the digital workshops or whatever it is. So having those defined in a contract can be really useful in everyone clearly understanding what success looks like. The basics of having a timeline with various stated points at which you would be approving things, and talk to your suppliers before you sign your contract about what's not included. There may be things that you're assuming would automatically be there that they would usually charge extra for. So negotiating those before you sign leaves you in a stronger place in terms of a negotiation, just because any scope creep that happens after you've signed tends to be expensive. Now, some of you might feel, well, I just don't have the expertise to be able to describe or know what a good version of this digital project would look like, exactly what functionality I need. I'm not confident in that area. So if you have time and you have a bit of budget, I would always recommend looking at contracting a scoping phase first. And there's two ways you could go about this. You could bring in an independent person who can help you come up maybe with a tender document and a brief that you can put out and get quotes for, and help advise you in the selection process. And that person could potentially be someone who might then carry on and help you project manage this and provide that technical expertise on your side of the table to make sure things run smoothly. Another version of this is you find a digital agency who's potentially got the expertise to build the thing, but rather than contracting them to build it, you initially contract them for a much smaller project to scope and define it. That has the advantage of, again, you get clarity on what you're getting, and also you get to try out what it's like to work with them. They will clearly potentially have a bit of an agenda around encouraging you to sign up for things that they know it would be easy for them to make and are within their skill set. And clearly the process puts them in a strong position to bid. So just bearing that in mind, that can still be a really useful way of just taking things in phases and having some control over that part of the process. Understanding rights and intellectual property ownership is really important in a digital contract. There can be a tendency to think, well, I need to own whatever is being created, I need to own it outright. And that's almost certainly not the case. What you need is to have the rights to use it in the way you need to be able to update it in future, and to share it in whatever relevant form that is. So whether that's accessing a digital experience at an event or having something that you're publishing online. If you ask to own something outright, suppliers are quite likely to push back. And there's a couple of reasons for this. If it's artists or creatives that you're working with, they normally want to retain copyright in their own creative material, but they will be looking to grant you either a time limited or a perpetual license to be able to use it in the way you want to. And that's the thing you're buying. If it's a software agency, they tend not to build things completely from scratch. They're almost always using background code, which can be a mix of their own proprietary code and software frameworks from third parties to get them up and running faster and make it cheaper and easier for them to build your solution, because they're then using that code base across multiple clients. So those are both entirely legitimate reasons why someone is not going to want to give you complete ownership of what they're building for you. And it's not what you need. You just need permission to use it in the way you need to be able to. And then the other category to think about around rights is third-party content. So that can be as simple as fonts that are being used in design work. It might be images from an image library, materials you're pulling from a local archive, or software libraries that the developers are using and incorporating into the work. And you need to know that you have the appropriate licenses, or the developer has passed to you the appropriate rights to use material that they've licensed. And finally, in that category is if you've got public contributions coming into the work. So say, for example, members of the public are sending in submissions online, or they're doing drawings in workshops that are being contributed to a project. You want to make sure at the point that they make those contributions that you collect the right written permissions to use them, and you have that information stored. So that might be ticking a terms and condition box in an online form or signing a form in a workshop, just making sure you've collected those consents up front. Other responsibilities that can creep into projects where there's ambiguity and that can cause potential disputes are listed here, some of the key ones. So if it's a creative project, do you, as a library service, need any kind of creative control on the final output? Artists typically want as much creative freedom as possible, but you may want the sign off on whether it meets your standards, particularly if it's, say, for a younger audience and you want to check age appropriateness. If you've got content that's being moved from a software system into a new system, who's responsible for importing it? Will the agency just provide you with test content, or are they actually going to help you migrate everything over? Where is it being hosted? Are you using council servers, or are you using the agency servers? And what level of user testing do you need? Is it just informal testing done by the supplier and yourselves? Is there more formal, structured acceptance testing? And is there a need to test with any focus groups? So that could be disabled users. It might be people where English is a second language. If that's required, who's going to recruit those focus groups, run the test sessions, collate the feedback, and is there budget to pay for any updates that might result from that? And final note, where you've got multiple suppliers working on a project, it is even more important to understand the handoffs and the roles and responsibilities. So there might be multiple contracts and you're sitting in the middle of those, and you just want to know that the different parties know how they're supposed to work together. And particularly if there's, say, design material that's being created for use by another agency, getting those formats clear, or if there's data that needs to go from one system to another, understanding that format. There's three areas where there are sort of standards requirements that I think are important to note. So accessibility, we briefly touched on. A lot of projects need compliance around AA, so Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There was an updated standard came out last year. And note on that, if you don't absolutely need rigid compliance, don't ask for it, because there is an element of trade-off around accessibility. There's no perfectly accessible system, and something that's AA or AAA compliant may be a less engaging or exciting experience if it's a creative experience. So just considering those trade-offs before you jump straight to we must have compliance. On the other hand, around data privacy and security, compliance is not really negotiable. So if you've got personal data in the system, either from the public or from library staff, then looking for that GDPR compliance, having data shown and processing terms and conditions in your contract, making sure the content is going to be hosted on servers in the EEA or equivalent jurisdictions. And likewise around data security, data storage, transmission, and importantly, when you're exporting data, so this is probably on your side, if you're exporting personal data out of a system and saving it locally on library servers, making sure you've got clear process and security around that, good user access control, checking with digital agencies that they're regularly security patching software so you're not got open vulnerabilities. Budget is usually the area people concentrate most in contract discussions. And I like to think about this in terms of the value triangle on the right-hand side. The rules around this are you can sort of prioritize two of the three aspects and accept sort of trade-offs on the third. So if I want to build a complex system to very high quality and I need it quickly, I'm probably going to pay a premium price. If I'm willing to reduce the scope and complexity somewhat, hopefully not have to make trade-offs on quality. And equally, if I can say to an agency, do you know what, I don't need this in 3 months, I'm willing to wait 6 months, that might give them flexibility on how they fit that around other work, reduce the amount of time they need to take in terms of the scope, and so there'll be cost savings. So think around that value triangle when you're negotiating. And then on the left-hand side of this slide, some more of the basic sort of hygiene financial factors. So rather than linking payment milestones just to dates, make sure you're getting some deliverables to check so you've got evidence of progress. Don't pay the final invoice on launch, because almost inevitably, no matter how good you're testing, when something goes live, the public will notice something in it that you haven't. And so have some time at the end, post-launch, to identify problems. The agency or the supplier has time to fix them, and then you make the final payment after they've been fixed. And as with any good project, you need some contingency budget, digital projects more than most. On that subject of change, in the contract, have a clear and simple process describing how you will handle changes. So what does that change request and approval process look like? What information do you need to sign off on a change, an updated budget, a new timeline, etc. Rather than lots of formal or infrequent formal reporting, better to have regular, less structured check-ins, keep the communication open, that avoids any surprises, allows you to respond rapidly to changes. If you are making those changes, do keep a record between you and your partners of what the decisions were, any impacts in terms of cost, time, other knock-ons. So if there's ever any queries about what was agreed and when, it's easy to go back and look. And a broader point, if you've got a project, particularly say a creative project where you've got multiple collaborators, just thinking through what happens if a party needs to withdraw, either because of personal circumstances outside their control, or, and I've only had it happen once in my experience, but maybe there's a falling out between creative partners. It's quite hard to completely protect against that because often those people are integral, but at least to have terms where people agree to hand over any work to date in return for payment for their work to date, and they don't have a sort of veto right on the project continuing. And there's also change that will happen beyond the duration of your contract. So thinking about that ongoing hosting, maintenance, updating the system, I would advise people usually, if you're negotiating a contract for build, in parallel, negotiate the maintenance contract for the first 12 months. So you're clear on the pricing and structure of that before you commit to the build itself. And you can also agree a rate card for additional work above and beyond that maintenance contract. So you know the daily or the hourly rate you're likely to be charged for different types of work. And if the supplier is willing, negotiate the basis for any future increases on the maintenance contract or the rate card. So at the very least, have a notice period. So if they suddenly put the prices up a lot, you've got time to shop around. But they might also be willing to commit that prices will not increase above the level of sort of UK inflation. Um, and there will be things that can happen on digital projects that will have a cost impact for you that are outside the supplier's control. The most frequent that I've come across is if you've got an app on the App Store, then periodically Apple or Google will update their technical requirements for those apps. And apps that are not updated in line with those requirements will be retired forcibly from the stores. So if you want your app to have a long life, you have to accept that from time to time your digital agency will come along and say, we're now required to make changes, and this is the cost for doing that, and they won't have control over that. And similarly, although it tends to happen less often, you might have a system that's integrated with something else or relies on something else to work, and that other system is no longer available, and you need to modify things to fit. So those things can come along and will need paying for. And finally, on the negative train of thought, if you did need to exit a contract, thinking through and having provisions for how that works. So can the software be handed over to someone else? People think sometimes that owning the source code is the solution to this, but the reality is it's very unlikely that one web development agency will take on another agency's code and agree to maintain and develop it further, because they don't know what's under the bonnet, what the hidden cost or impact that might be. They can't guarantee the quality. So often, unfortunately, if you've invested in a completely bespoke system and that supplier goes out of business, you may well be looking at having to create a new system, in which case you need to be confident you can get your data content out of systems in a usable format that you or another party can read. So typically something like a comma separated value or an Excel spreadsheet or other database formats, not just the proprietary code of the person who built the system in the first place. And finally, last couple of slides, and on a more positive note, pulling all this together, really good contracting is about setting that ethos, that tone of collaboration and communication, both parties having a good understanding of their roles and responsibilities, you appreciating that they need your time, input, and expertise to do their job properly. Scope for you and your team to be able to see work in progress and give feedback, clarity on who's going to be signing off and making those sign-off decisions. And if this is a product, a system that other library staff are going to need to use, then making sure there's handover and a training period so other team members can take on and use that product or service. And I distill all of this into three sort of mindsets to have around a good contract. So first of all, you don't necessarily need reams and reams of complex detail. Having clarity, documents that people will read, digest, and understand is far more important. Taking that long-term perspective, if it is a system that you're likely to want to use in a few years' time rather than a short-term project, thinking through what that looks like and what you need to have in place. And finally, seeing this whole thing as a partnership exercise, not a procurement exercise. So you don't want that top-down command and control, go away and build this mindset. You want a much more collaborative approach, and a really good contract will reflect that. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing and see if anyone has any questions.
Okay. And while we're waiting to see if anybody's got any questions, I will invite our panel to join us at this point. So Candide and Lizzie and Carrina, if you're available. Hello, hello, hello. I think what I'll do is we'll do the intros, the three of you, and then I'm going to get you to sort of, if any of you have any comments about what John just talked about, anything sort of resonated with you or anything you'd want to pick up on, that will be my starting point, and then we might get some questions from that. So Candide, can I start with you? Will you introduce yourself, and also will you give a description of yourself?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, lovely.
Lovely. My name is Candide. I am a white woman. I am wearing a blue top. I have medium brown hair, and I'm sitting in my office with reading glasses on as well. Thank you for having me.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about your role
Yes, so I'm the panelist on the developer side of things. So I am the co-founder of Novellic. Novellic is a software development agency, very much centered around reading for pleasure, books, and anything to do with book publishing. So we service book publishers, book charities, libraries, and we also have and maintain our own app for book readers, book clubs, book recommendations, all that sort of thing. So we're very much immersed in the book world, but developing software across the board around the ecosystem.
Thank you. And was there anything, sort of reflecting on John's kind of overview, was there anything that you'd particularly pick up on or think was interesting?
I think that was brilliant coverage. I mean, all the things that we typically worry about from this side of the table, things like scope creep, things like how the user behavior, the user journey has been thought out and planned. I think that coverage is very relevant to us when we approach a contract. Also, all the bits about intellectual property, ownership of the code, reusability of it in other projects, and that sort of thing, and also how that impacts the pricing. So obviously, when we're talking to an audience that is predominantly council-led or public entity, budgets are crucial, regardless of where the funding's coming from. So it is quite important to kind of consider what trade-offs can reduce the price of a project, and how you can probably, get more for whatever budget you have to spend on a digital project.
Yeah, there's a real skill, isn't there, in asking the right questions or being able to articulate, without knowing what the other party wants and thinks, being able to kind of get into that.
100%.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Thanks, Candide. I'll come back to you in a minute. Lizzie, would you like to introduce and describe yourself and sort of give us a sense of your work, what it is that you do?
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name's Lizzie Nixon. I am a white woman with a dark brown bob, and I'm wearing a black cord shirt, sitting in a meeting room, which has a whiteboard and things behind me. So my role, I'm the senior manager for creative program and partnerships at Sunderland City Council, working in the culture team, but with the great privilege of working across Culture House Sunderland, which is our very beautiful new library, opening soon in the heart of the city centre.
Smashing. Again, to you, did there anything that from what John talked about? So we're going to get into the kind of the specifics of the work that you're contracting shortly, but was there anything that made you think, oh yes, that's right, or anything that surprised or that would be you would think differently?
There were some things John talked about there that I was like, oh, we did that and I forgot about it. Which is like, so for example, and I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, but we have, for our digital commission, we contracted 3 individual artists to work together. And some of the conversations that we had were about, like, what happens if that relationship breaks down between the artists? What happens if one of them doesn't want to do it anymore? And they all had very distinct roles. That mean that the artwork probably couldn't happen without each one of them. So when John was talking there about, like, what would you do in that scenario and just making sure that you've planned for that, it made me go, oh yeah, we did plan for that. We did think about that in the contracting. Stuff that thankfully hasn't happened, but actually the work, yes, touching all the wood, but the work that we did on that, I think, has put us in a comfortable position for if anything like that did happen.
Smashing. And as you say, we'll talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. And Carrina, the same to you. Would you like to introduce and describe yourself and say something about your work? And then I'll ask you to think about was there anything in what John said that was particularly pertinent to your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Carrina Blake. I'm operations manager with Coventry Libraries. I'm a white woman in her 40s. I've got blonde hair and I'm wearing glasses. And very similar to Lizzie, as John was talking, I was sort of reflecting back, little moments of memory were coming back. And I think it was about this time last year was when we were really in the middle of developing our digital commission with Coventry. I think having all of those conversations, pulling all of that information out and making sure then that those conversations were documented, I think that was the bit that was really crucial. So having the conversations and then popping in a little email, making sure we'd got it jotted down somewhere so that we could, as everything was developing, we could then refer back to it. I found that a really, really great reflection that John just delivered, and yeah, took me right back to where we were a year ago.
Thank you. That's great. John, is there anything else you wanted to add before we go into the case studies?
No, that's all good from my point of view, and looking forward to hearing the case studies.
Smashing. And then we'll get you to rejoin us at the end for the sort of final kind of mop up. Thanks ever so much. Thank you. And so I guess for the other three of you, I'm going to spend a bit of time with each of you. Are you okay to just stay on camera while the others are speaking? Then we can jump backwards and forwards if necessary. So I'll just explain to the audience that we felt that to get the three of you, it's fantastic because we've got the Candide looking at it from the supplier's point of view, but also to explain. So Lizzie and Carrina are both going to be speaking about particular, and they have wider experience, but we're really looking at the digital commissions that they created or are creating actually as part of our digital spaces program. So this is a program Space is running in collaboration with 9 English library services, and each of those library services has created its own beautiful, wonderful digital artwork or a digital project. So the examples that we're speaking about here are on the kind of the creative end of things, and Candide is going to be talking about LibraryOn, which is more as an app that sort of services the needs of readers. So that's just a bit of context. So I'm going to go to Lizzie first. So you've explained to us your role and that you work with Culture House. Can you, Lizzie, can you just give us a sense of the project that we're going to be talking about, which is Timepiece? Can you sort of set that up?
I can, of course. So I think to understand Timepiece, it's important to understand our building. So Culture House is a library, but it's also packed full of digital features. So we've got a media studio, podcasting spaces, a 360-degree immersive studio, creative computers, and in the atrium, as you walk in the building, across 4 floors, we've got 36 LED screens, which create this kind of amazing immersive experience. And the digital capabilities of the building are really important for us to live out our library functions in a digital world. So, how do we share stories? How do we share information? How do we make sure we're providing a really exciting experience for our audiences? But with all of that tech in a library and with modern library users, our traditional library users, I was a little bit worried about when we open how our library user who might be used to a bit more of an analog space from us might approach the building, and whether the threshold to accessing it might feel a little bit high and a bit scary and a bit techy. So that was one of the founding principles of Timepiece. And then the other founding principle, I suppose, is that we wanted the building to be a place where people meet. And in my youth, growing up in Sunderland, you would meet your friends before you could text them outside of C&A. And in my parents' youth, you'd meet them outside of the department store, Joblins. And the thing that these things had in common was a clock, so you could tell if your mates were late. And I was like, do we even have a clock in the atrium? Like, is that a thing that we have? And we don't. We don't have a clock. So I suppose I came up with the idea of Timepiece to perform 2 functions, and it is an artwork that makes use of heritage and archive materials, as well as submissions from residents and heritage groups and compositions and field sounds and all of that kind of brought together to create an immersive experience that chimes on the hour every hour in our atrium across these 36 LED screens. And it tells the time, and that's its primary function, but it has a more poetic function of kind of signalling where we are in Sunderland's past and present and future. And so it's a really exciting artwork, I think, and it's functional, but it's also poetic and beautiful as all good art is. But I think residents will really see themselves in it and will really see their city represented. And shout out to Joblins in the chat there, which I'm loving. And just really kind of see themselves in that. And I think even the fact that the chat is going live with a bit of Joblins crack, like actually, hopefully that's the sort of response we'll get from residents.
So you're painting a picture of this sort of beautiful work, and we should say it's not finished yet, is it? Still in development because
Not finished. The building nor the artwork is finished.
Yeah. But it will be, and then
but it will be.
Yeah.
Soon.
So you're obviously what we were talking about is there's technology, there's artists, there's a relationship with the space. This is quite complex, I guess, complex contracting. Do you want to talk us through the the contracting, the beginnings of this process, and what about it's been interesting for you?
Absolutely. Interesting is the word. It's been a wildly complicated contract, I think. So it was a 5-way contract. We had lots of people apply who were individual artists, and then we had this trio of artists apply. And so the contract is kind of 5-way between the local authority, the space, and the 3 artists that are involved in the project. And it had to take into account like the licensing of all the heritage materials from third parties and who those rights would sit with, and the IP of the artwork and the artists and who would get it and how. And in loads of ways, this was complicated by the fact that it was a digital artwork rather than like a sculpture. You could know who owned it and you'd know who owned the rights to it, but that is much more complicated when it's digital, and very bespoke to our venue, because there aren't very many venues that have a 36 screen immersive experience in their atrium. So like, how could we tour it, and what is the legacy of the work, and so to whom is it useful actually beyond the life in the venue? Who could access it in future? What do the rights need to look like? So it did feel complicated. So we sat down and we did a bit of a brain dump of the principles of what we needed, I suppose. So what did the artists need? What did they want it to do for them? What did we need? What did we want it to do for us? There was a very little push and pull on that, I suppose. It felt quite like collaborative in that way. But then I'm really grateful to the space who then pulled that together in a wanna. That made sense. And then we ran that by the local authority legal team, and those of us who work in local authorities will know that's not a quick process. So then there were a few tweaks and it did take a while, but we managed to get there in the end.
What do you think the main challenges were?
In terms of the contract? I think absolutely the kind of the fact that it is a digital artwork. So, we're working with legal representatives in our organisation, in our local authority, who are very skilled and very, brilliant. But digital artwork is just new for us. We're really working it out as we go, like what those contracts need to look like. We do quite a lot as a local authority of like commissioning or supporting public art in public spaces, and that feels as a bit tried and tested and we know what we're doing. We didn't really know what we were doing in terms of digital commissioning and contracting, so just a bit of explanation on that, I think. And I think also the fact that like none of us really there's so many third parties involved. So Yorkshire and North East Film Archive are providing some content that we've licensed, and so are North East Museums, and so are heritage groups in the city and residents. And actually, like, who does own this artwork is a really interesting question to unpick.
Do you have an answer?
I think it's everybody. But it does pose kind of complications and challenges for the legacy of the piece, and once it's up for the period of time that we've licensed that content for, then like how can we show that it happened and that it's a thing? And I think the answer is some bits we can and some bits we can't. The artwork changes on the hour every hour as well. And so like some 3 o'clock might be usable forever, but 4 o'clock might not be, so there's just stuff like that. That's just really challenging about this one.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? It's just so all of those bits weaving together, and I'm going to ask you more questions about it later, but that's a really excellent intro for us. Thanks ever so much.
No problem.
So I'm going to ask Candide to kind of to talk a bit about a specific, you've set up, you know, your Novellic and the work that you do. And for this, you worked with the London Libraries on the Read On project. And when we spoke before, you described it as a really successful project, and that it worked in 2 phases, which I think it echoes this whole idea of sort of developing in collaboration and everything. So, and the fact there was 2 phases to the project, you sort of think of as been part of why it's been so successful. So I wonder if you could sort of tell us about it and how you laid it out, how you started that first phase, and then we'll talk a bit about what changed in the second phase.
Absolutely, yes. So Read On is an app that was conceptualized entirely by the librarians within the London Libraries network. We were introduced to them through a university that is a mutual contact. And what impressed me at the time was that the librarians had actually thought through everything. They'd wireframed the app, they'd thought of all the different features, all the functionality, all of that. They just didn't have the resources to build it themselves. They knew what they wanted to an extent that it's actually quite rare to get a digital product client sort of really knowing the ins and outs of their app in that way. It made life like
why do you think that is?
Because I think there is a product design skill set that doesn't necessarily sit organically on the client side. So sometimes you'll know that you need a website, but you wouldn't necessarily know, you might forget that you need a contact form. Just to simplify, it could be something like that. You might have thought of all the bits that you kind of need on there, but you just didn't have the full rounded scope of view to sort of really think through every single page. But this project, had all the pages wireframe designed, quite rudimentary, but they knew what they wanted to build. We had 2 problems then. They knew they wanted it built, they didn't have the funding for it, and they didn't have a developer. They were introduced to us, so one of those got ticked, but then it was up to the 2 of us. So this was where it was quite fruitful that we met at the time that we did, because we could then scope it technically. So they had scoped the design work, and they knew that, for example, so a bit about Read On. Read On is very much similar to Catch to 5K, the NHS's app for getting people running from, being absolute couch potatoes to running 5Ks, but it's for readers. And I think they'd come up with a plan for that during the pandemic, when they were trying more digital outreach to reach library users at home, get everyone reading for pleasure a bit more. So there was a lot more focus on digital product design in that phase of sort of library work, especially with libraries being shut off to the public and a lot of the services going digital. So Read On measures, it gives you a 10-week reading plan. It gives you weekly targets in minutes. So there's no pressure on, say, completing 500 pages or 3 books. It's very much, put aside 10, 15 minutes before bedtime. Let's see how you get on with your reading. So that was the very first phase of Read On. And when we came into that relationship, the first thing that we did was translate that into technical requirement. So, it was up to us to kind of ask the questions of, right, this needs to go on Android and iOS. This is probably the best tech stack that we could use. This is the hosting that we would recommend. These are all the, the backend systems that we could work on. And because we were very aware of, this being a library project and them probably having to go for grant funding, which sort of does cap the size and scope of a project technically, we were able to make technical decisions very early on, even before grant application, which meant that we could sort of give them a ballpark figure of how much they were looking to raise to get this off the ground. And then LibraryOn were running their second, I believe it was the second grant system. That was 2023. And so that application was ready to go because the technical scoping was done, the product design was done. And so that was, almost out of the box sort of ready for a grant application, which did come through, and they did get the funding that they'd applied for. So we had a very short turnaround. Now, this is where grants sort of come with their own restrictions and requirements. There was a very strict turnaround time of 4 months. That in itself also limits how much you can do technically. So, you know, with a dev team, 4-month turnaround that includes getting up to speed with content as well, and doing all the final user testing before launch. It gave us it helped us actually rein in any product scope creep that could have happened had that restriction not been in. So in a way, it is a blessing, but it did mean that we had to really restrict what was on there. So that was phase one. And then obviously it got launched to the public, got promoted across the libraries network across London. And over the 2 years, and I was really happy that John mentioned this, when you have apps on the app stores, you do get technical requirements from the app store owners. So they'll update iOS or they'll update Android. They'll require you to add specific functionality, or do messaging differently, do your notifications slightly differently, get different permissions for camera use or location or what have you. So all these kinds of things meant that at that point it was up and running. The money had run out because it was for funding the development of it and the hosting, but not for additional there was no additional scope to kind of improve it based on user feedback or really based on what the app stores were requiring. So that's when together we scoped phase two and what that would look like, and also what the resilience of the app would look like. So it also gave us the sense of how can this be stronger in the longer term and not really rely on these gaps of funding in between.
Did you know there was going to be a phase two when you started on phase one?
No, absolutely not.
It's an opportunity. In a way, it's an opportunity to sort of think, what more could we do?
We sort of were aware that there was fixed timeline for an app being out on the App Store without further development. So we sort of scoped that to 18 months to 24 months, and just kind of thinking, if it's a success, then it means that you can go and probably raise additional funding. If it's not, then there's lesson learned there, and we move on.
That's interesting. I'm going to ask all of you actually, but just while we're talking about this then. So in this sort of contracting, is this idea of sort of like imagining the golden future where you can have the perfect thing? Is that sort of part of, so contract is not just about what you're doing right now. There's a whole lot of developing.
I think with experience, you sort of try and you always learn for the next one, right? So every single contract and every single project we've worked on has given us a bit more information for what needs to go into the next contract. We always say that any software that we develop, at least for 12 months from launch, has to be covered for maintenance, because bugs will exist, platforms will slightly shift, user feedback will come in, anything beyond initial testing. So that, I think, comes out of the box. I think what we did learn more was about the resilience of, especially because it's publicly owned, like public service owned, IP ownership within libraries. London Libraries is a consortium. So there was that other added disadvantage of them not being a registered entity that could actually contract themselves. So there was a lot of contracting technical difficulty that just was unique to this project, just because we were commissioned by a consortium of libraries.
And how did you get around that?
So they opted to use, so London Libraries is a region, is a defined region within Libraries Connected. So they opted to sort of shift that responsibility onto Libraries Connected, which I think also opened a whole other Pandora's box of like ownership and IP and all that, because they own the IP, they retain the IP for this project. But it's just how we could have one entity contract. For the grant application, there was a nominee service, there was a nominee authority that actually applied for the grant. But then it wouldn't have been fair to put on the burden of continual hosting and maintenance onto that individual authority on behalf of 33 others.
So it's the whole thing sounds to me like it's quite a creative activity, contracting in of itself and having to kind of problem solve. And
it is. I would say contracts themselves are fairly standardized, specifically within. I mean, listening to Lizzie was fascinating because in software development, in web development, app development, most of the clauses are standard. Most of the clauses are fairly, you have maybe a choice to make halfway through about, maintenance of code and, ownership of the source code. But other than that, beyond that, it's fairly standardized. It's how you then go about delivering that project and how you set up the very initial structure of how often we'll meet, what the approval turnarounds will look like, how the project management is going to be communicated effectively across the team. For me personally, that setting that up is far more important for me personally than getting the contract right, because the contract is fairly standardized. Again, I put my hand up and say this is a privilege because of the types of projects that we work on. That doesn't necessarily translate across all digital commissions.
Yeah, well, as you said, the library is so good at sort of getting themselves into a good place to start with. Lizzie or Carrina, is there anything you wanted to add in at that? Any thoughts you'd like to add in at that point? Just wave if you've got something you wanted to say.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute.
Yeah.
I suppose it just strikes me listening to Candide about the real variety in digital projects, right? And like how for us, one of the challenges was about the bespokeness of the platform or the canvas, if you like, and how that posed a particular challenge around contracting, whereas like actually Candide's in there's a pretty standard contract for apps is just really interesting, and it's like digital projects are not one homogenous type of thing, are they? They're like it's just really fascinating, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Candide. We'll come back to you a bit later on, and there's more questions. So I'm just going to bring Carrina in at this point. So you sort of obviously been hearing to what the others are saying, and I was going to ask you to speak specifically about Soothing Sounds of the City, which is another of the digital commissions that were a part of the Digital Spaces programme. How did you approach? You might want to explain a bit about the project and how you approached the contracting.
Yeah, so I guess listening to Candide as well, it's that creative element of it. So we didn't start with a finished product. We didn't know what we wanted to create at the end. We just knew that we had an opportunity that we wanted to take a full advantage of. And we started to then scope, and it was that exploration stage that was so very important. Lots and lots and lots of conversations and ideas and listening. So sort of working out who we wanted to talk to and who we could have to advise us. So we started out with the idea of libraries as safe spaces. That was our starting point. And we recognised there were people, we're in the middle of a really busy city in Coventry, but we have people that are coming into the library space because they feel safe, because they need a little few moments of calm. And that gave us an idea about immersive experiences and how are they accessible for everybody. And maybe there's an immersive experience that has got some health benefits to it and that we can make as accessible as we can. And at first, we thought this was going to be some images, some projections. We were imagining lots of different things, talking to lots of different people. But then we started to go down the route of audio. And we started to listen to the professionals and the artists that were telling us that sometimes less is more, and an audio experience, it can be just that. And so that really got us changing our direction at those early stages whilst we were still scoping. It was allowing that to happen, even though it felt quite unknown.
Mm.
And then it was that perspective of then narrowing it down. So feeding back to what John was talking about, we needed to think about our limitations, our restrictions, what was important to us, what was the longer term application that we were looking for. And so that was then led us down the route of thinking about a sort of a gamified app. So we had 3 strands to Soothing Sounds of the City. The first was working with communities, delivering some workshops, learning about sound therapy. From that, then there was the creation of some audio libraries, starting the development of an interactive app, which was a fun way that people could interact with these sounds and start to create their own soundscapes. And then finally, we had a launch event so that we could really celebrate and showcase the benefits of sound. So we had those 3 key moments that we were aiming for. And along the road, we wanted to make sure that we tied in all of the relevant partners, colleagues, and making sure that we were getting those decisions to align with everybody's needs as we went along.
And what did you do? Can you be specific, do you think, about what you did that enabled that? Is it what sort of, and how you work, how you operate?
Yeah.
How did you get it to actually work?
So early on, we had our contacts. So we started to think about, right, we're going to need to work with somebody from legal within the council. We're going to need probably some advice from our digital colleagues, our comms colleagues, information governance. So we kind of reached out to our contacts, even when we didn't fully have an idea about this tangible, what was it we were talking about. It was just checking in with them and saying, we're developing, what will we need to consider? And thinking about timescales as well, because at that point we were starting to be able to say, are there any crucial times that we need to avoid, or how much notice are you going to need if we need to develop things? So those early conversations, just checking in, and then that meant that then when we did have more of a scope, more of an idea, we'd already had those initial conversations. We'd already got a little bit of buy-in from them. And we were trying to fine tune the message so that it was specific to each of their needs as well, so they could see the benefits. So what are the council priorities and how does it fit into that as well? So it was really sort of just making sure that we were not going to be putting more onto them. So respecting their needs and trying to make things as concise as we could. And I guess to help that, it helped when we had some images or some prototypes. As we went along, we were able to engage with them using some of these samples. And again, working with our suppliers and artists, they were brilliant at being understanding why we might need to have some of that as we went along. So a few sound samples really helped. A rough demo of the app. We were able to have these then to start to go out to our decision makers and show them what we were developing.
Yeah. It sounds like a bit of there's not like a straight line, is there? There's all the way along. You're kind of picking up and doing different things and working out what are all the steps, and like that thing of having a conversation when you don't know exactly what it is that you are talking about. There's a bit of kind of building goodwill, isn't there? And I mean, these things are obviously, but it's really interesting to hear you sort of reflecting on so much about the relationships and finding the people and involving as many people as possible.
And sometimes some of the language was very new to us as well. So we did find that we could link those with the technical knowledge and make sure that it was all aligned. So I'm trying to translate some of the terminology, particularly when it was coming to making sure we were hosting the app, thinking about ownership longer term, and was there any training needs afterwards? We wanted to make things as open and available as we could as well, so that for us it was also about the legacy. So some of those sounds can potentially be downloaded and used by other creatives in the future.
Smashing, thank you. Does anybody have any other comments on the back of what Carrina's just said? Anything that you wanted to add or carry on with? Go on, Lizzie.
The thing about tech knowledge and tech language has been such a learning curve, I think, and I just like echo that, Carrina, 100%. And one of the things for us has been we are working with a technology partner who are doing the kind of install of our tech and the scoping and the tech specs and all of that, and they've been so useful in that kind of bringing them into the conversation with the artists. So that, and sometimes I'm going, okay, so I'm just checking my understanding here. I think what we're saying is, because I don't always understand the language, and having somebody who is in that space who does is really useful. But then at that same time, that adds like a few more cooks to it, doesn't it? And so there's a lot of, like, it does make it more complicated as well. So there's been a lot about like masks and tech specs and stuff for the space that like absolutely went over my head, and I'm now kind of getting my head around what all of that means to an extent.
Thank you. Are we going to go back to Candide, actually, because you talked about, Novelli working in tandem with the libraries to create Read On. So is there any more that you could say about the process of co-creation from your side and how that really works successfully? Which more, I guess, we're always thinking about people coming to a webinar like this, somebody who's approaching this maybe for the first time or hasn't done it for a while. You know, what's kind of useful to know for working with the supplier?
Absolutely. I mean, so this was an example where, like I said, there was a full scope almost ready to go, but that was phase one. And so obviously none of us knew how the audience and the public would respond. If, you know, a lot of it was intuitive. There were tweaks that we made in early on. So one of the advantages of us running our own Novellic app is we generate a massive amount of book recommendations and book lists, and we curate books already. So one of our introductions, like my own personal introductions in terms of features and functionality into the LibraryOn app, was to, in addition to doing quizzes and challenges, which the librarians had designed, I said, why don't we do book recommendations as well? So, you know, you're looking for inspiration on what to read. So that was something that we kind of collaborated on. With usage, we found that that actually had, you know, one of the highest track touch points within the app, and also, you know, sort of was grounds to develop further around that specifically. So, you know, when we were thinking about phase two, thinking about how things could improve, there were some obvious ones. So, for example, with quizzes in phase one, you'd do a book quiz, you'd get a score, move on. You know, in phase two, that gets upgraded, so you get to see which answers you got correct versus the ones, you know, that you didn't. You could retry. That sort of basic step up of a functionality is almost intuitive. That's going to happen. But it's the touch points where there was more magic that could be built on, you know, so there was more, right, you know, but what if the user could also, you know, then generate their own book list, and then what if they could then, you know, ask their librarians if that book was available, and they could then, you know, sort of reserve it, put it on hold and all that. There are obvious technical limitations to working with LMSs across 33 different services, but that was a scope, an area scope where we thought, oh, okay, yeah, let's run with this. Let's see, to take this one bit of, you know, of a feature and functionality and kind of run with that. And that was where the collaboration really kicked in. You know, there were this is where working with an agency or a software developer, they can add in, you know, those little sprinkles of functionality and bells and whistles that the straightforward, even well-scoped, super well-defined app really didn't cater for. So, you know, with phase two, we're also introducing badges, achievements, you know, more gamification. You unlock, you know, longer reading streaks would unlock a specific badge that you can then, you know, sort of have within the app and that kind of thing. So there is an evolution to the product design as well. You know, there's always a technical requirement side of things, just because platforms do evolve, but there is that features and functionality product roadmap that was developed together.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You sort of, and then how does that tie back into the contracting? So you've kind of gone thinking one way, and then you've gone off and somebody had some magic ideas, and you want to, how do you then sort of tie that back, and you sort of go revisit the paperwork and say, we need to adjust this, change it, and
yeah. So again, it always boils down to, you know, what are the sources of funding? You know, what is the turnaround time? What is the, what are the general plans for this piece of digital software, you know, over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years? And then you can plan accordingly. So in our case, you know, LibraryOn went for another round of grant funding. So we were again ready with the scope of work and also with a sustainability plan. And I think that is the crucial thing here. So the big difference for me between phase one and phase two is beyond phase two, this digital product has a life of its own that can self-fund itself. So the way we're doing this is we're unlocking the app to regions and services outside of London on a subscription basis, where all that pot keeps it hosted, keeps the maintenance coming through, content being developed, everything feeling fresh, challenges, quizzes. Because one of the other challenges that we found was, even though there is strong buy-in, you know, London libraries conceptualized this was not imposed on them by any third party. Once that product goes live, 2-3 months down the line, everyone's busy with something else. So the content started to get a bit stale. all the librarians who were super enthusiastic about creating challenges, quizzes early on, they have, they have jobs, and they're over-resourced and under-resourced, sorry, overworked, and so we had to step in as the software developers with editorial content creation as well. So, there was a lot of that longer term thinking of, okay, how can this be sustainable, not just from technical point of view, but also from editorial and content as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Carrina, are you thinking about sort of sustainability in the long term? Is that sort of part of your thinking with this project?
Yeah, so when we were developing it, we definitely thought through that and had those conversations relatively early on. So so we have had a handover with our in-house digital teams. So, but again, like John said, that didn't happen immediately. So we always knew that was the plan, but we had our supplier on board past the point of delivery for any problem solving, and then there was that training and support, so that the official handover, so that then if there is any further developments, any changes, we can still do that. And we've also got the details about if we did want to purchase some of their time to come back on board and work with us again in future. We've got some of those details as well.
Thank you. And Lizzie, just one other question to you, sort of going back to the idea of, we talked about sort of the relationships a lot, but in terms of the working with artists, the expression of interest that you put out, I think it's still publicly available, so maybe just put a link in, because I think it's really interesting. But was there anything when you sort of started to think about contracting with creatives or artistic partners, is there anything you've learned from that you think would be useful for people to think about?
From the EOI process?
Yeah, because almost before, it's like a pre-contracting stage, isn't it?
It is. I think some of the things that were interesting about the EOI, and what I'd say is the support from the space around this was really useful. So Natalie from the space and the space contracted a sound artist, Nick Ryan, to support as well with our writing of our EOI. And that was just really, really useful. And, versions of the EOI went back and forth between us and had those different perspectives across them, I suppose. So that was really helpful. But what was tricky was to strike the balance between this fully fledged idea that I'd had about a clock in the atrium that did a particular thing and served these functions, but leaving space for artists to do what artists do and to interpret that and to present a unique artistic vision for that. We do try and standardize all of the EOIs that we put out, or all of the briefs that we put out for commissions, so that artists know what we're asking for them if they're kind of used to responding to us. But this was more challenging because we needed to include some technical information in there. We needed to include like a range of stuff that we wouldn't ordinarily include in an EOI. So that was a bit of just a different way of doing it, I suppose. And we also didn't want artists to do loads of unpaid work in expressing an interest in this project. So we'd asked for like a link to previous work and proposal ideas. But we had a range of artists, from those who were like really digitally capable and this was their bread and butter, to maybe artists who hadn't worked so much in this space before. And so the responses were really different, and we had some very techie whizzy ones that it could be easy to be like, well, it's them, but that's not what we'd asked for. So being really fair to those who had responded in what we'd actually asked them to do was, we had to be mindful of that. And in the EOI, we also presented an indicative budget and an indicative timeline, and that's no longer what the budget looks like, and it's no longer what the timeline looks like. So kind of changing that into the contract was important. And another thing that we did was provided a bit of a budget to do a proof of concept for the shortlisted artists, which we hadn't originally planned. And if I was to do it again, then I would plan for that, and I'd make sure that our budget reflected that as well. So there were a few things that, like, you'd think you could do like a lift and shift from the principles of the commission to the principles of the contract, but actually it did just change along the way as we started to build those relationships with the artists who responded to us. And I think means that we've got a better contract and a better outcome because it's responsive to the kind of ways that we'll be working together. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to see if John's got, I'm asking John if you've got any questions or comments or thoughts on what's been said so far. And then we kind of get into the end of the session. I'm going to just be asking about pitfalls in the way of is there anything you'd like to say to our audience about what to look out for or what to be mindful of? So that would be my question to everybody. But John, before I get to that, anything that you want to respond to what our panel have been saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just a really interesting range of kind of examples and case studies. So, I mean, picking up on what Lizzie was just talking about, but also earlier, I think that idea of building a kind of collaborative process with artists or whoever your suppliers are is really important. So, as Candide probably knows, and I can attest to, when you're on the other side of this process and you're pitching for work, there's a huge amount of time and effort that goes into that. And coming across clients who think, oh, it's great, we'll just get all these proposals in, and not factoring in the fact that that's an enormous amount of effort expended by a strange sector on creating that stuff. So to narrow down quite quickly and to say to people, there is a small budget for prototypes for the 3 agencies we shortlist. We're only going to interview 5, so they know, what the kind of parameters are on that process can be really important. And then Lizzie touched on this as well, that sort of discussion at the beginning, going around talking to the artists about what they need, the library service understanding what it needs, pulling that together into a simple sort of summary, non-legal document. So sometimes lawyers will call that heads of terms, but just having that shared understanding of the key things that this contract needs to hit is really important, especially, Lizzie, you'll be maybe pleased to know that your contract is the most complicated I've ever worked on in terms of the numbers of parties. So it was really important to do that. But just as a general good practice on any contract, to say, okay, what are the key points here before we get into the legal drafting and so on? From what Candide was saying and the question you asked, Linda, about, why is that skill set around scoping and understanding what a thing is so hard? And it is quite a skill and needs a range of experience. And it's partly about just being able to think through, if it's an app, what some of the things are that apps need to do, or a website, what sort of things they typically need to address. So having that knowledge, understanding, again, quite domain specific, what the sort of tech pressure points are, if you like. So what kind of functionality is really complicated and challenging, what is actually very simple to scale or do. So someone who knows that already can rapidly get to a kind of viable spec within a broad budget. And then the key art is describing that clearly back to whoever needs to understand it, into the sort of schedule in the contract that describes what the thing is. So again, a skill like wireframing, drawing out a thing in black and white, seems very simple, but requires a little bit of expertise to do really well. And so having people around you who can do that, who know the tech stuff, can be hugely valuable. And then finding that sort of plays out again in what Carrina was saying and conversations I was involved with around that project, where there was a pre-existing sound app and a guy who built a thing. And then being able to have a conversation about, oh, well, if we added that feature or did it this way, is that really complicated for you to do? And there were some things in that conversation that we thought might be quite difficult, where that person was able to say, well, actually, when I originally built it, I built it with that in mind. So that bit is really easy and I can do that for you. And that allows us to repurpose other budget elsewhere. So again, that's part of that drawing, seeing the suppliers as partners in the process and having an open conversation about what you can do that everybody benefits from, which means you get better value for money. So yeah, I thought they were great case studies, and those are my reflections on that.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go round and sort of say to everybody, somebody said to you, I'm about to commission a new digital project, what would be your, let's just say 1 or 2, I mean, you might have hundreds of bits of advice, but what would be your sort of top piece? What would you really like to get across to them? So Carrina, I'll start with you. But sorry, before I do, David has raised his hand, but we can't put you on camera. So if you want to ask a question, David, just stick it in the chat. So, but anyway, so if you'd like to do that, but Carrina, what are the sort of the main 1 or 2 things you'd really like to get across to the audience?
I would say to try to prototype early if possible. That I found was really beneficial for us to do that, to also then gain buy-in as we went along. I would say avoid procurement, so consider more complicated routes that might make your life much harder, and if you can avoid them, especially plan for delays.
Yeah, time creep as well as
Very
scope
much.
creep. Thank you. Lizzie, what would be the one or two things you would really like to say to people?
I would definitely say give yourself loads more time than you think you need. And I think at the beginning of this process, so many people, Nick, the sound artist, others warned us that this is quite ambitious and it's going to take a lot of time. And I think I was quite cavalier about that. The time it took to sort the contract out, the time it took to amass all of the heritage materials that have become part of the artwork, the time it's taken to create the work, like all of that is just give yourself more time than you think you need. And I suppose linked to that is about making sure all the ducks are in a row around the tech element. So it's for us, it's a wildly complicated canvas, and it has its needed expertise that I certainly haven't had. So we did need an interpreter, and that I suppose links with what Carrina has said earlier on. But then the other thing is be really ambitious, and I recognise that those two things are probably linked. So I'm going, be ambitious, but it's going to take ages. There's an opportunity to use digital in a really playful and creative way, to connect with audiences in a new way, in a more accessible way, whatever. So let's be really playful with it and see what the possibilities are. And then I suppose that loops back to, well, give yourself a bit more time to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks ever so much. And Candide, from your point of view, what would you be saying to a library service that you were going to start working with, or consortia or whatever?
So I would just say it's a process more than anything else. I think that's what, for us at least, controls time, scope, all of that. So we very early on set up a weekly meeting that just, sort of autofills the entire development lifecycle. And we set up a working group so that approvals are turned around fairly quickly. If anyone can't make that meeting, that's absolutely fine. There's someone from either party on the call every single week. We set up Trello boards. I find Trello boards are super easy to keep track of, more so than, other project management tools and software, because it means even non-technical users can always just get a broad view of what everyone's working on, if anything is in a chokehold or waiting on, someone. And I would say from a design point of view, always think of the end user and how they're going to be using this, but also think of bad actors and how, where the stress points of the platform are as well. So, that could be malicious, but that could also be negligent, so that could be, if what happens if nobody uses this, what happens if nobody champions this within the service as well, what if there's no buy-in from colleagues, but also what if someone comes in with purely destructive behavior, looking to really break the system. So as you're kind of just thinking through product design, if you kind of have that in mind, and you're always mindful of, right, this is how 90% of our users are going to use this, they're amazing, they're fabulous, but this is how, maybe 1% might not use it as per design, what happens then? And then also on the time management and the project management side of things, just keeping things under control. We found that cuts scope creep, and it cuts delays to launch. And always, the other point is you could phase out launches as well. So, as you're kind of planning things, don't give up good enough in search of perfect. Sometimes there's enough to launch with a product roadmap of, here's what next week's release will be, the week after and the week after, and getting it right for the first 100 users, maybe perfecting it for the next 1,000, and then getting it absolutely brilliantly spot on for the wider community. So, there are so many tips of just how to project manage the digital project, which aren't necessarily the contracting side of things, but it's just bear that in mind as you are contracting.
It's all of listening to all of you is making me think that we're talking about contracting for digital contracting of digital projects, but it's not just about the contracting, is it? Everything is tied, so knit so much together. You also have the whole approach, thinking about what happens afterwards, all of it is really, really linked together. Thank you. John, anything from you?
Yeah, I think it's to your point, Linda, the contract is the thing that underpins everything. It's the thing, in a very worst case scenario, it's sort of the prenup agreement of what happens if things go really badly wrong, but more likely it's just the thing you turn to if things are going slightly awry or something's changing. So it's an important foundation to get that right. But all the principles of good digital project management then sit on top of that. In terms of a top tip, not already mentioned, it would be find someone who's done something similar already and talk to them about their approach, again, to the general project management of it, and also potentially to the contracting of it. And if they've got a template contract or something they're willing to show you, confidentiality aside, that can just be a really good thing to read through and think, oh yeah, we haven't thought about that. But take it with things like both Lizzie and Carrina's projects. There's a lot of unique stuff, and what Candide was talking about in terms of the app, there's a lot of unique elements there, but there's also actually a lot of things that are common across digital projects. So yeah, talking to someone who's already been through the process can be a really useful way of learning.
Okay, smashing, thank you. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. We've put a link to the evaluation for the webinar, the form for evaluating of this webinar into chat. So if you wouldn't mind filling that in before you leave, that'd be fantastically useful. But I'm going to wrap up, unless anybody, and that I'm including you in that, anybody, Jill, is there anything that anybody else would like to say just before we finish from the panel? Just wave or start chatting if there's something, if you think, oh, there's something I want to add in. Go on, Jill.
I just have a question which sits slightly outside the contracting for digital projects. I was interested, Lizzie, when you were describing your project about setting it up to tour, and like the kind of how that could be quite difficult given the kind of the way that it's set up. Did you find anywhere that would take the work afterwards? And are you thinking about touring it?
No.
I guess it's quite specific.
No and no, I think is the short answer. It's a conversation we had because of contracting. So we wanted to kind of ascertain whether if the artists wanted to tour the work or use the work in another way, would we be cool with that, basically? And obviously we've got branch libraries, and we were wondering how it might be possible to represent the artwork in those spaces as well. I think it is so unique, the canvas and the way that the work is created, that actually it's just not possible. So and the licensing means that there'd be like 10% we were allowed to use in perpetuity and 5% we're allowed to use for 5 years, and so, like, it's really complicated. So our answer was no. What we've decided to do instead is to use the time now in the creation process to kind of create a bit of a legacy video where we might show some of the kind of context of the work and film it when it's in situ, but making sure that we're only using the bits that we can use forever, as a bit of a legacy film of it. But no, we can't tour it. But that was a useful conversation to have about future digital work that we create and whether we would want to or be able to tour that in future.
Look forward to seeing the work, hopefully in situ then. Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. I think on that note, we'll finish.